Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. There are places where silence is heavier than words, and the mountains keep secrets that time has chosen to forget. In the deep Appalachian Mountains, where the fog wraps around the valleys like a cloak of forgetfulness, there is a story that makes us question what we know about the limits of human nature. There have always been differences in West Virginia. Its mountains stand like old guards, watching over everything that happens between its canyons. In 1908, when that remote area was still a long way from modernity, people lived by their own rules away from the law and civilization. The roads were dangerous paths, neighbors lived far away, and those who chose to live in those heights were often alone. The Harrove family moved to a remote area in Pocahontas County, where winter came harshly and stayed for months on end. They were used to working hard and living in the mountains, which can be tough. The house was made of strong oak logs and was in a clearing surrounded by thick forests that seemed to swallow up all sound. It was a place where you could scream and no one would hear you. The darkness of night was complete and unrelenting. Thomas Harrove was a man of few words and many silences, who ruled that estate with an iron fist. People in the area knew him for being quiet and for keeping his family away from the few people who lived in those mountains. Elelonina, his wife, was even more mysterious. People only saw her when she went down to the nearest small town to buy food and other necessities. Local shopkeepers talked about how she always looked like she was far away, even when she was right in front of them. The winter of 1908 came sooner than expected. The first snow fell as early as October, covering the mountains in a ghostly white that made the landscape look like a quiet, dead space. Things started to change on the Harrove estate during those cold months. People who passed through those lands noticed a different kind of quiet, one that went beyond the lack of sound. It was like life itself had been sucked out of that place. We don't know exactly when things started to go wrong, but we do know that it was during that long winter. There wasn't much food. The cold cut through even the thickest clothes, and the loneliness felt like a heavy weight on the shoulders of those who lived there. Thomas had grown even more distant, spending whole days in complete silence. Elelonina, on the other hand, seemed to wither like a plant that didn't get enough sun. The stress inside that log house grew like the snow outside, layer after layer, until something had to break. A wandering hunter was the first person to notice that something was very wrong. He was walking through the area, following deer tracks, when he saw that there was no smoke coming from the Harrove chimney, even though it was very cold in late January. He carefully walked up to the house and saw that the front door was slightly open, swinging in the cold wind that came down from the mountains. What he saw when he walked into that house would change how people in that area thought about the mountain's isolation forever. The hunter stood in the doorway long enough for his old boots to freeze his feet. The inside of the house was dark, except for the weak rays of winter light that came through the cracks in the poorly sealed windows. The air felt heavy, and it seemed to take the oxygen from his lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. The only sounds were the wood creaking under the weight of the cold and the wind whistling between the boards that weren't put together well. He yelled at the people who lived there, and his voice echoed through the empty space in a way that made him shiver. Nobody answered. The fireplace hadn't been lit in days, maybe even weeks, and the temperature inside the house was almost as cold as it was outside. Things were thrown around the room, and furniture was turned over. The marks on the walls told stories without words about what had happened there. The hunter was used to the harshness of the wild and was an experienced man, but this was different. This smelled like something terrible that had happened to people. When he finally got the guts to look around the deepest parts of the house, he found disturbing proof that the family had stayed there long after they should have gotten help. Torn clothes, broken things, and signs that something had slowly happened in that small space during the long winter weeks. but the people who lived there were completely gone, as if the forest had eaten them or they had just stopped existing. The man went down the mountain faster than he had gone up it. He stumbled through the deep snow, eager to get to the nearest town and tell them what he had found. People in the local tavern watched him with a mix of doubt and morbid curiosity as he spoke quickly and confusedly. The Appalachian Mountains have always been good at making up strange stories that blurred the line between reality and legend. But the look on the hunter's face made everyone there think this time was different. A small group got together to go up to the Harrove estate. They were men who were used to the hard life in that area. Blacksmiths, lumberjacks, and merchants who knew every trail and every danger in those mountains. They had lanterns, ropes, weapons, and everything else they might need to deal with whatever was waiting for them up there. The climb took hours, through snow that came up to their knees, and the sky was gray and promised more storms before nightfall. When they got to the property, silence was there to greet them like a person. The house stood out against the mountains like an open wound in the white landscape. They all went in together, and no one wanted to be the first to cross that line. What they found backed up what the hunter said, but there was more. They found strange tracks in the snow at the back of the property, near the old barn. The tracks came and went without any clear pattern, as if someone had walked in circles for hours or even days. A man named Jeremiah Stone, who had been the county sheriff for many years, was told about it. He had seen it all while enforcing the law in that wild area. He rode to the Harrove property with his 2 deputies, who were young men who hadn't yet learned how to deal with the worst parts of people. Stone looked at every part of that house with the care of someone who knows that details matter. He wrote down what he saw in a worn leather notebook that he always kept in his coat pocket. The sheriff was most upset by what he didn't find, not what he did find. There were no bodies, blood, or clear signs of direct physical violence. It was as if the family had broken up and only echoes of their lives were left behind. The bed sheets were all messed up. There were dirty dishes on the table from a meal that was never finished, and the wall clock had stopped marking an hour in the early morning. Everything pointed to a sudden break in daily life, but there was no clear reason for it. Stone told his men to search the woods around the property for 3 days. Search parties walked for miles over rough ground, following every trail and checking every cave and ravine where someone might have fallen or hidden. They only found the mountain's emptiness, that old silence that had been there long before the first settlers came and would still be there long after they were all gone. People asked the closest neighbors, a family that lived almost 10 kilometers away. During the coldest nights in January, they said they heard strange noises coming from the Harrove property. They couldn't say exactly what those sounds were, but they were creepy enough to keep them awake even after the noise stopped. But no one had gone to see because, in the mountains, you learn not to get involved in other people's business, especially when winter makes every trip a risk. County records showed bits and pieces of information about the Harrove family. Thomas bought the property in 1903 with cash, which was not common at the time. There was no record of him or Elelanina in the local archives before that. It was as if they had just appeared in those mountains, bringing only the bare necessities and a strong desire to be alone. The merchant, who sometimes sold things to the family, said that Thomas always seemed eager to finish deals quickly and didn't want to talk about anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Elelanina was even more of a mystery. The few women who met her in the city said she was like a ghost. It was as if only her body was there, and her mind was somewhere far away and hard to reach. She always wore simple dark clothes and looked down, never making eye contact with anyone. The blacksmith's wife once tried to talk to Elelanina, offering her real sympathy, but Elelanina only mumbled something that couldn't be heard and quickly walked away, leaving her half-finished purchases. Sheriff Stone started to think that the story of the Harrove family was more complicated than it seemed. He sent telegrams to counties nearby and then to other states in an effort to find out anything he could about the couple before they got to West Virginia. The replies came slowly because of the snow and the communication problems of the time. When they finally did come, they raised more questions than they answered. A sheriff in Pennsylvania talked about a couple who fit the description and had lived in a remote area near Allegheny for a short time. They left suddenly in 1902 after an event that was never fully explained. Another story from Ohio talked about a property that was quickly abandoned, leaving behind debts and unanswered questions. Patterns were starting to show up that suggested a life of constant escapes and sudden changes, always to more remote, isolated places, away from the eyes of society. In the meantime, the locals became morbidly interested in the Harrove house. Even though the sheriff told people not to, some people started climbing the mountain just to look at the property from a distance, as if they thought the wooden walls would tell them their secrets just by looking at them. People started to tell stories about the abandoned place, each one more detailed than the last. These stories mixed facts with guesses, making up a mythology around the place. In February of that year, Reverend Samuel Blackwood, a local pastor, went to the property. He brought his Bible with him and his belief that there were forces beyond human understanding at work in those mountains. He stayed inside the house for almost an hour without saying a word, and when he came out, he looked shaken. He wouldn't say much about what he had been through, only that some places are heavy with actions that can't be undone, and that certain atmospheres take in the essence of the events that happen in them. Spring came late in 1908, but when it finally did, it brought the thaw that turned the mountains into a maze of temporary streams and mud that was hard to walk on. During this time, a shepherd found something that got the investigations going again. He found personal items buried just below the surface of stones and branches in a hidden ravine that was almost 2 kilometers from the Harrove property. They were simple things, like a hairbrush with dark strands still stuck to the bristles, a crumpled silver medallion, and torn pages from what looked like a diary. Sheriff Stone looked closely at each item. The diary was hard to read because it had been damaged by time and moisture, but some parts could still be read. The writing was thin and probably belonged to a woman. The entries were from the fall before last. The words were disturbing in their simplicity, describing a growing sense of imprisonment, of walls that seemed to close in even when outdoors, of a presence that constantly watched. The last entry that could be read ended suddenly in the middle of a sentence, as if the person writing had been interrupted or couldn't think of what to say next. Stone set up a new, focused search in the area where the things were found. This time, he brought in sniffer dogs from a nearby county. These dogs are trained to find tracks even weeks later. The dogs acted strangely, barking nervously, and not following some commands, as if something was stopping them from going forward. Their trainers had never seen them act like that before, and after several hours of trying and failing, the search was called off. Months went by, and the Harrove mystery slowly became a local legend. The property stayed empty because no one wanted to claim the land or the house that was still standing, despite the passage of time and the elements. The county finally took ownership because the property was abandoned, but even then, no one came to buy it. People stayed away from that place for some reason. It had a bad reputation that made the land seem worthless, no matter how valuable it really was. In the summer, the Appalachian Mountains were still in a different way. The heat was so thick that it turned the valleys into natural furnaces, and plants grew out of control, slowly taking back the areas that people had tried to tame. As if nature wanted to hide the Harrove estate from people's memories, vines and shrubs slowly took over the property. But hiding something isn't the same as making it go away, and the people who saw what happened that terrible winter couldn't stop thinking about it. Sheriff Stone couldn't stop thinking about the case. He often found himself guiding his horse toward that mountain while on his regular patrols through the county, as if some unseen force were pulling him back to that mystery that had never been solved. He spent hours going over his notes, looking for patterns he might have missed and links that were hidden in the subtext of the testimonies and observations. His wife said that he was sleeping less and that he would wake up in the middle of the night with a blank look on his face, lost in thoughts he didn't share with anyone. An unexpected event in August of that year brought new information to light about the mystery. A lawyer from Charleston came to the county to represent interests that he wouldn't fully explain. He brought papers that showed that Thomas Harrove had made an informal will a few months before the events of January. The will said what should happen to the property if something happened to him and his wife. The document was odd, with strange clauses and language that seemed to be purposely unclear on important points. Stone asked the lawyer a lot of questions, but the man stayed professional and only gave the bare minimum of information. He said that Thomas had asked him for help during a rare trip to Charleston and had paid in advance for any future help that might be needed. The meeting had been short and formal, and Thomas had refused to say why he thought he needed to make such plans. The lawyer said he was very upset but determined, as if he was getting ready for something he thought was going to happen. Some parts of the document's instructions were very clear, while others were very vague. They said that the property shouldn't be sold or lived in forever, that some things inside the house should be destroyed but didn't say which ones, and that written records should be kept but not shown to anyone who might want to see them. It was the kind of will that made more questions than it answered, as if Thomas was trying to say something important but was afraid to be too clear. Stone chose to do one last, thorough search of the property before the plants made it impossible to get to. He put together a small group, which included the county doctor, a scientist who could look at the evidence from a different angle. They climbed the mountain one September morning, when the air was still cool from the night before and the mist hung over the valleys like ghosts that didn't want to leave. The house was in worse shape than Stone remembered. It had only been a few months, but it felt like decades of neglect had taken a toll on the building. The rain could easily get in through the broken windows, leaving dark patterns of mold and decay on the wooden floors. Parts of the ceiling had fallen down, letting sunlight shine through and make bright pillars in the dark room. It was like watching a place die as it slowly changed from a place where people lived to a forgotten ruin. The doctor looked at the house with a professional eye, looking for clues that others might have missed. He saw marks on the walls that made it look like someone had walked the same paths over and over again, wearing down the surface. He found deep scratches in the wooden door of the master bedroom that were made by human fingernails. This made even this man of science shudder. But once again, there was no clear proof, just unsettling hints about what might have happened. They found the most important thing in the basement. Stone had been to that area before, but this time he noticed things that had seemed unimportant before. They found a bunch of leather-bound notebooks in the darkest corner, behind empty shelves. They thought they were only Elelenina's diaries because of the pages they found in the ravine, but they were also Thomas's. Pages and pages of small, neat writing, with accounts going back years before he came to West Virginia. The diaries told a story that was much more complicated than anyone had thought. Thomas wrote about a family that was haunted by something he called the shadow. This presence followed them around and got stronger and stronger over the years. He said he felt like he was always being watched, that he heard voices in the walls, and that things moved without explanation when he woke up. According to his writings, Elelenina went through even more pain. She would go days without speaking and wouldn't leave certain rooms. She also made up strange rituals that Thomas couldn't understand, but that she said were necessary to keep them safe. The entries got more and more broken up and hard to understand as they got closer to 1908. Thomas wrote about how they were becoming more and more alone, and how moving to the mountains of West Virginia was their last chance to get away from whatever was following them. He said that Enslavement thought that complete isolation was the only answer, and that they might finally find peace if they were far away from other people. But the last entries made it seem like that wasn't enough. The last thing Thomas wrote was on January 15th. His handwriting was almost impossible to read because the words were rushing over each other in a hurry. He wrote about choices that had to be made, paths that couldn't be taken back, and the heavy burdens that no one should have to bear. He finished with a mysterious phrase that Stone read over and over again, trying to figure out what it meant. Some burdens cannot be shared, only ended. The doctor said that the diaries clearly showed that the people in them had serious mental illnesses, and that the shadow that haunted the family was not caused by anything outside of their minds. Stone wasn't sure. He began to doubt simple explanations because the details of the stories and the fact that the experiences were the same over the years. But he also knew that the human mind could make up whole worlds and turn fears inside into threats that seemed to come from outside. Autumn came and painted the mountains in shades of amber and crimson. This was a beautiful sight that stood out sharply from the darkness that had settled over the area. Stone decided that the diaries should be kept in the county archives, but only after he made detailed copies of some parts that he thought were very important. He spent nights by candlelight copying down what Thomas and Enslavement said, trying to put together a puzzle whose pieces seemed to belong to more than one picture at the same time. He kept coming back to one part of the text. Enslavement had written about dreams that kept coming back. She saw an empty house floating in a gray void, with all the doors leading to the same place and all the windows showing the same empty landscape. She said that when she woke up, she felt like she had switched places with something, and that the person sleeping in the bed was not fully herself anymore. Stone knew these were false, but the way they were written was poetic, in a way that made him feel uneasy in ways he couldn't fully explain. In October, the local newspaper wrote about the case, being careful with their words so as not to cause panic or too much speculation. The reporter, a young man who had just moved to the area from Richmond, had talked to a number of people in the community and put together a story that tried to balance what was known with what was still a mystery. The article drew unwanted attention to the county, with people from all over coming to see the abandoned property. This turned a private tragedy into a public spectacle. Stone had to put up signs along the path to the Harrove house to warn people about the dangers of unstable buildings and dangerous ground. But warnings don't usually stop people who are morbidly curious. People kept climbing, taking pictures, and collecting small things as creepy souvenirs. Each visitor told their own stories, like how they felt strange sensations, got chills out of nowhere on hot days, or thought they were being watched by invisible eyes. Stone didn't know how much of it was real, how much was just suggestion, or how much was just how places that have seen tragedy affect how people see things. Stone got a letter from a Boston researcher in November, almost a year after the first events. The researcher had become interested in the case after reading the newspaper article. The man said he was a researcher of strange psychological phenomena and was interested in cases where whole families seemed to develop the same patterns of strange behavior. He asked for permission to look at the diaries and go to the property, saying that he could help based on similar cases he had studied in other states. Stone didn't trust academics or their theories, but the chance to finally get answers made him agree to the visit. In December, the researcher, a thin, middle-aged man named Dr. Nathaniel Webb, came with suitcases full of books and notes on cases he thought were similar. He spent 3 days carefully reading the diaries, making a lot of notes, and sometimes looking up with a thoughtful look on his face before diving back into the yellowed pages. When they finally went to the property together, Webb walked slowly through each room, touching the walls and closing his eyes as if he were trying to take in something that normal senses couldn't. Stone watched with a mix of doubt and hope, hoping that this stranger from Boston would make things clearer for him instead of making them more confusing. But in the end, Webb just shook his head slowly, and his face showed either pity or an understanding that there were limits that couldn't be crossed. Webb told Stone what he had learned in a private conversation at the police station when he got back to the city. He said he had seen similar patterns in other isolated families, where extreme social isolation and certain psychological predispositions led to what he called deviant shared realities. He thought that Thomas and Elelenina had built an internal world so complex and separate from the outside world that they couldn't tell the difference between the two anymore. The shadow that haunted them was real to them, as real as the mountains around them, even though it only existed in their minds. Stone asked Webb what he thought had happened on that last night of January. The researcher stayed quiet for a long time before answering, picking his words carefully. He said that when two people build an alternate reality together and completely cut themselves off from what everyone else thinks, they can make decisions that make sense in that reality, but are hard for people outside of it to understand. Whatever Thomas and Elelenina did, it was probably the end of the journey they had started years before, when they chose to run away instead of facing their problems and isolating themselves instead of getting help. Webb left, leaving Stone with more theoretical knowledge but no peace. The fact that there were possible explanations didn't make the mystery any less scary. The sheriff still felt like he owed something because there were no bodies and no clear proof of what happened to the family. He had promised to protect and serve the people of his county, but how could he protect someone from themselves, from ghosts that only they could see, and from realities that only they chose to live in? Winter came back to the mountains with the same unrelenting force as it had the year before. It was as if time was cyclical in that area, always going through the same cycles of cold and isolation. Stone sat in his police station and watched the snow fall outside. He remembered that it had been exactly 12 months since everything had started. The Harrove estate was now completely cut off from the outside world. The snow had piled up so high that the mountain looked like a silent white fortress. It was like nature had decided to permanently close off that area, ending a story that people had not been able to finish. Stone thought a lot about Dr. Webb's theories during the cold months. He was both fascinated and disturbed by the idea of deviant shared realities. He started to pay more attention to other isolated families in the county. He would visit remote homes under the pretense of routine checks and look for small signs that they were too detached from the community. He found out that there were more people living on the edges of society than he had thought. People and families who had chosen to be alone for reasons they didn't talk about with strangers. The Morrisons lived on an estate that was almost as far away from the mountains as the Harroves, but in the opposite direction. In February 1909, Stone decided to visit them. He rode along trails covered in ice and brought food as an excuse for the visit. The Morrisons welcomed him with careful hospitality, the kind of politeness that lonely people show when they need more than just being alone, but are still afraid of the outside world. Stone brought up the Harrove case in a casual way during the talk. The response was quick and telling. Mrs. Morrison's face turned pale, and she and her husband exchanged meaningful looks before she looked away and clasped her hands in her lap. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat a few times before saying that they knew the family and had talked to them a few times in the first few months after the Harroves moved to the area. However, something had come between them that they couldn't fully explain but that made them very uncomfortable. Finally, Mrs. Morrison spoke. Her voice was low and unsure. In the fall of 1907, she ran into Elelenina on the trail while she was carrying baskets of wild herbs. They had tried to talk, but Elelenina couldn't seem to pay attention. Her eyes kept going to the shadows between the trees, as if she was waiting for something or someone to come out of the woods. Elalina had said something that had haunted Mrs. Morrison ever since. Walls only work if you believe in them. Mrs. Morrison shook her head when Stone asked her to explain what that meant. She didn't know, and that lack of understanding was part of what made her so upset. It was the kind of thing that made you think of a whole world of hidden meanings, a specific cosmology that only the person who said it could understand. After that meeting, the Morrisons had purposefully stayed away from the Harrows. Now they felt guilty and relieved at the same time. They may have been able to help, or they may not have been able to. But the truth is that they chose to stay out of something that was clearly beyond their ability to understand. In the spring of 1909, more people came to the area out of curiosity. People from other states were coming to see the place they had read about in the newspaper article. It had spread beyond the county's borders. Some people were just curious, while others acted like investigative journalists. Some even said they had special abilities to sense the supernatural and offered to get rid of any lingering presence on the property. Stone didn't let anyone in, but he knew that a lot of people went up the mountain anyway, even though he told them not to. But one of these visitors brought new information that got the investigation going again. An elegantly dressed woman from Richmond said her name was Catherine Hartley. She came with an old picture and a story that linked the Harrows to a past that no one had been able to find before. In the picture, a group of people stood formally in front of a big house. Catherine pointed to two people in the background who were partly hidden by the shadows of a porch. She thought they were Thomas and Elalina, who had been photographed more than 10 years before. Catherine said that the picture was taken in Maryland in 1895 during a party that her family had planned. She was young then, but she vaguely remembered the couple because they left the gathering suddenly and without saying goodbye or giving an explanation. Years later, her mother talked about how the couple had some kind of nervous problem and were always looking for new places to find peace, which they never found. Catherine's mother had just died, but she had told Catherine that she recognized the names when she read about the case in the newspaper. Stone looked at the picture very closely. It was hard to be 100% sure because of the quality of the picture and where the figures were, but there were similarities that couldn't be ignored. If it really was Thomas and Elalina, it meant that they had been on the run and alone for a lot longer than anyone thought. They weren't just a strange family who died in the mountains. They were people who had been running away from something for years, moving to more remote places, cutting ties with everyone until all that was left was themselves and the ghosts they carried. Catherine said she could tell more about what her mother had said. According to the stories, there were rumors at the time about Elalina's family of origin. People whispered about hereditary tendencies toward mental illness, and about a family history of strange behaviors that showed up in each generation. When Thomas married Elalina, he was said to have cut off all ties with his own family. At the time, this was seen as a sign of romantic devotion, but looking back, it seems more like a desperate attempt to start over and leave behind all the problems of the past. Stone thanked Catherine for the information and said he would keep the picture in the case files. He sat in the police station for a long time after she left, thinking about that old picture. The shapes weren't clear. They were more like suggestions of people than clear pictures. But he couldn't help but study them closely, as if he could find hidden truths in the shadows that had been caught on paper. The thought of people running for so long with burdens they could never really leave behind because they were part of them was very sad. The county made a decision about the property's future in the summer, when it was very hot. After more than a year of being ignored and the fact that it was impossible to find heirs or anyone else with a legal claim to the land, it was decided to tear down the house. The building had fallen apart so badly that it was no longer safe for the stubborn visitors who kept coming, even though they were warned. Stone was in charge of the demolition himself because he wanted to make sure it was done with respect, even if only he knew who or what that respect was for. Under the hot August sun, the demolition crew worked for 3 days. Stone watched as the walls that had kept so many secrets fell down one by one, showing interiors that hadn't seen the sun in over a year. They didn't find anything else important, no hidden clues that could finally solve the mystery. All they found were rotten wood, everyday household items that had been damaged by time and neglect, and that strange silence that seemed to come from the ground itself. Stone felt something when the last wall fell. It could have been relief or sadness. The Harrove property was no longer a physical structure, but he knew that it would live on in the memories of the people in the area, becoming a legend, a cautionary tale, and a mystery that people would tell on cold nights for years to come. Over the next few weeks, the rubble was taken off the property and carried down the mountain in carts that creaked under the weight of rotting wood and pieces of what had once been a home. Stone told everyone to burn everything in a clearing far away from prying eyes. The physical remains of the house turned to ashes that the Appalachian wind blew across the mountains. He thought it was a kind of ritual, a way to say goodbye that was probably more for his own peace of mind than for any real reason. Stone hoped that interest in the case would finally fade now that the house was gone. He wanted people to find other mysteries to think about, but the result was strangely the opposite. Without the physical structure, the story seemed to get stronger and more ethereal, which made it more powerful. The Harrove story became completely the property of the collective imagination when there were no real walls or rooms to look at. It was free to grow and change in ways that real life would never allow. Reverend Blackwood started using the case in his sermons, but Stone said that he never used real names. The pastor talked about how dangerous it is to be spiritually alone, how the human soul wasn't meant to be alone all the time, and how important it is to have community and connection, even when the world seems too hostile to face. His words struck a chord with the congregation in a way that most sermons don't, and Stone realized that there might be some truth to that approach, turning tragedy into a lesson without going into too much detail. In the fall of 1909, Stone got a letter from an anthropology professor at the University of Virginia. The scholar had gathered research on isolated communities in the Appalachian Mountains, looking at how being so far away from other people affected families, social interactions, and the mental health of the whole group. He had read about the Harrove case and asked if he could include the story in his work, of course, changing the names and some details to protect privacy and local sensitivities. Stone thought about the request very carefully. He wanted the story to stay buried with the house's rubble, but on the other hand, he wanted it to come out. On the other hand, he knew that letting scholars look at the case might be helpful for other families who were in similar situations of despair. In the end, he gave limited permission, giving out edited copies of the diaries and official reports, but keeping the most disturbing parts to himself, since he saw no reason to share them with the academic world. In November, the professor went to the county and spent a week talking to people who lived there and learning about the area's geography. Stone went with him on a walk to where the Harrove house used to be. Now, it's just a clearing with stone foundations that are only partially visible because plants are quickly taking over the area. The academic took a lot of notes, took pictures of the area, and collected soil samples, as if that could tell them something about what had happened there. Stone looked at it with educated doubt, not believing that scientific methods could show what was really important about that place. Stone found the professor's observations surprisingly insightful during their nightly talks at the local tavern. He talked about how the extreme terrain of the Appalachians made places that were both geographically and psychologically isolated. He also talked about how it was hard to get over those mountains, which made invisible barriers that were just as hard to get over as those made of stone and forest. Families that chose those more remote places often had complicated reasons for doing so, and being alone there usually made any problems or weaknesses worse. The professor talked about other cases he had looked into, including stories of families that had done well on their own and others that had been destroyed by it. He said that the difference was usually not how isolated the people were, but how well they could stay connected to a shared external reality, even if it was only through visits to the city or letters to distant relatives. When these last ties were broken and a family became completely self-referential, the risk grew by a huge amount. During those talks, Stone ended up saying more than he meant to. He talked about how the case had changed his understanding of the limits of his role as sheriff and how he had thought about it over the months. He could keep people safe from outside dangers, but how could he keep them safe from themselves, from decisions they made with all their heart that led them to invisible abysses? The professor paid close attention and asked questions from time to time that showed he understood not only the case at hand, but also the larger issues that it brought up for all people. Before the professor left, he gave Stone a copy of his earlier work on communities that are cut off from the rest of the world. Stone read it during the long nights of the coming winter. He found it strange comforting to think that the Harrows were not the only ones who had gone through something like this. Their tragedy was just one of many variations on common human themes. Putting the mystery in a bigger picture made him feel better, even though it didn't answer the specific questions that kept bothering him. The county changed when 1909 turned into 1910. They were planning new roads that would connect communities that had been cut off from each other before. Slowly, progress was making its way to the mountains. It brought with it both new chances and the loss of some kinds of solitude that had been a part of life in the area for generations. Stone had mixed feelings about these changes. He knew that better connections might stop future cases like the Harrows, but he also knew that they would take away something that had been a big part of the character of that place, even though it was dangerous. Stone visited the old Harrow estate one last time in March 1910, more than 2 years after the first events. That year, spring came early, and the clearing where the house had been was full of wildflowers coming up through the last bits of snow. It was a remarkable change. Nature cleaned itself by covering up human scars with new growth that didn't ask questions or remember anything. He sat on a stone that had been part of the foundation and looked at the mountains that rose up in every direction, blue and hazy in the distance. He thought about how Thomas and Elena had walked those same paths, carrying their invisible burdens and looking for safety that they could never find because it was inside them. He thought of all the people he had known in his life who fought demons that no one else could see, built walls instead of bridges, and chose to be alone because connecting with others seemed scarier than being alone. Stone took out of his pocket the silver medallion that had been found in the ravine. It was one of the few things he had kept with him that he shouldn't have. He found a small daguerreotype of a young woman inside. He thought it was Elena when she was younger, before the weight of life settled in her eyes. She smiled a little in the picture, but it wasn't a real smile. It was as if she knew that happiness was only temporary, and that no matter how hard she tried to hold on to it, it would slip through her fingers. He buried the medallion in the clearing and used a smooth stone he found nearby to mark the spot. It wasn't a real memorial. There were no words written on the stone or formal ceremonies. It was just a quiet way of saying that people had lived there, suffered there, and no matter what happened on that last night in January, they should be remembered as more than just a mystery or a warning story. They were people, complicated and flawed, looking for peace in a world that doesn't often give it away for free. Stone knew he probably wouldn't come back when he came down the mountain that afternoon. In his files, the case would officially stay unsolved. It was a thin folder of papers that would eventually be put into permanent storage, where dust and time would slowly take it back. But he would keep the questions with him, letting them change him in ways that only unsolved mysteries can. They would always remind him of how fragile the human mind is, and how little we can really know or help each other. In the years that followed, that part of the Appalachians had to change. The promised roads were finally built, and they cut through the mountains with a determination that seemed to go against the very shape of the land. Previously separate communities became connected in ways that changed how they interacted with the rest of the world. Progress came with its clear benefits, but it also slowly took away the unique sense of solitude that had defined that place for so long. Stone was sheriff until 1915, when he decided it was time to give the job to a younger man who could deal with the changes that were always happening in the county. After that last trip to the property, he never talked about the Harrow case in public again. He kept his thoughts to himself, as if they were personal secrets that he didn't want to share. When curious newcomers asked him about the story that some of the older residents still talked about in quiet conversations, he would just say it was an old case that had been closed in the best way possible given the circumstances. But the story had a life of its own, like all stories do. People told it in taverns and around campfires, and over time it changed from a true story to something more like folklore. Some details were added, and some were taken away. The line between what really happened and what people thought happened got more and more blurry. Some stories said the house was haunted by angry ghosts, while others said there were hidden treasures or secrets that governments tried to keep from the public. The more boring and sad truth that people were just lost in their own mental mazes was less satisfying to the collective imagination than more dramatic stories. Logging companies set up shop in the mountains around the area in the 1920s, which led to a short period of prosperity. People came from all over to work, and many of them had no idea what had happened in the area before. Logging teams, looking for good trees to cut, would sometimes find the old Harrow estate, which is now completely overgrown by the forest. They would find stone foundations covered in moss, rusty things that were half buried in the ground, and they would always ask the people who lived there. Depending on who they asked, they got different answers. Some of the elders told versions of the story that were mostly true, while others liked the more colorful versions that had grown over the years. Some people even said they saw ghostly figures walking through the woods in that area. Stone, who heard these stories in his retirement, knew that this was the kind of story that places with a lot of mystery always made up. Mountain towns were hit hard by the Great Depression of the 1930s. Logging companies left, leaving behind ruined economies and landscapes. Many families had to leave homes they had lived in for generations and move to cities in search of work, which they rarely found. The mass migration changed the area again, bringing back the quiet and deserted areas that had been there before roads and trade came. During this time, Stone, who was now an old man living out his last years in a small townhouse, got an unexpected visit. A woman in her 40s said she was a distant niece of Elelanina Harove, the daughter of a brother Elelanina had left behind when she ran away with Thomas years ago. She had spent years looking into her family tree, trying to fill in the blanks left by relatives who had gone missing in strange ways or cut off all ties with their roots. The woman, who said her name was Margaret, brought papers and pictures that showed Elelanina's family tree going back 3 generations. The story was full of disturbing patterns of self-imposed isolation and behaviors that family and friends called strange at best and very concerning at worst. There were stories of aunts who had completely cut themselves off, cousins who became obsessed with strange things, and a grandmother who had spent her last years refusing to leave her house. Stone listened more and more closely, seeing patterns that Dr. Webb had talked about years before. Margaret didn't want to blame or judge. She just wanted to understand. She admitted that she sometimes had to fight against her own tendencies toward intense anxiety and intrusive thoughts. She used her family's full history to put her own problems in perspective. She realized that she had a legacy that went beyond her physical traits and talents. It also included weaknesses that she needed to keep an eye on. Stone told her what he could, leaving out the most upsetting parts but being honest about what he had found in general. He gave her copies of some parts of the diaries that he had kept, letting her read the words of her great-aunt. This connected her with someone she had never met, but who she was related to by blood and possibly by inclination. Margaret cried quietly as she read. It wasn't exactly because she was sad, but because she recognized herself in those yellowed pages, seeing her own inner struggles in the shadows. Before she left, Margaret asked Stone if he thought people like Elelanina, who might have been like her, had a chance. Stone thought about the question for a long time, taking into account decades of experience and thought before answering. He said he thought there was, and that the most important thing was knowing when to ask for help and keeping in touch with other people, even when your gut told you to completely shut yourself off. Elelanina and Thomas had made the opposite choice, cutting off all ties until only the two of them and their shared demons were left. There were no outside anchors to remind them that reality was bigger than what they thought. Margaret thanked him and said she would stay in touch, even though they both knew she probably wouldn't. Some conversations only happen once and serve a purpose that doesn't need to be continued after the first meeting. Stone saw her leave, knowing that she was taking with her knowledge that was both a burden and a tool, a weight and a chance to be free. Stone died peacefully in 1941, taking with him memories that he had never fully written down. As he wanted, his personal files on the Harrow case were given to the county. They were added to the official documents that were already in the administrative building's dusty basement. Not many people cared about those old records, which were left over from a time that seemed more and more distant as the world changed around those mountains. The region faced new problems and had to change its priorities because of World War II. Young men went off to fight in far-off places, and those who stayed behind worked on the war, which didn't leave them much time to think about old mysteries. The land where the Harrows had lived had become just another wooded area among many others. Only a few people who still remembered the history and occasionally shared it with people who were less interested could tell the difference. In the 1950s and 1960s, the area changed again when tourists came to see the natural beauty of the Appalachians. There were new trails, small inns opened, and the local economy slowly changed from getting resources to providing services for tourists who wanted to have real mountain experiences. Some business owners in the area figured out that old stories could bring in tourists, so they started putting stories about haunted houses and unsolved mysteries in brochures. In this case, the Harrow story was brought back to life, but in such a different way that Stone probably wouldn't have recognized it. It turned into a story about a family that was cursed, spirits that wanted revenge, and strange events that brave visitors could still see if they were willing to hike to the clearing where the house used to be. As they climbed the mountain, tour guides told groups more and more detailed versions of the story, pointing to twisted trees as proof of evil forces and interpreting natural forest sounds as signs of the supernatural. David Chen, a young historian, came to the county in 1972 to work on a project that would record the oral histories of the Appalachian people. He wanted to separate fact from fiction and the many legends that had grown over the years and keep real stories alive before they were completely lost in commercial embellishments. His academic interest was piqued when he heard different versions of the Harrow story that didn't agree with each other. Chen spent months looking into the case, starting with the county archives, where he found the original documents that Stone had put together decades before. It was shocking how different those factual records were from the stories that were being sold. He talked to the oldest people who lived in the area. those whose parents or grandparents had lived there during the events of 1908. He collected bits of memories that had been passed down through the years, sometimes changed by time, but sometimes keeping details that official records didn't have. One of these interviews was very revealing. Chen talked to a 93-year-old woman named Sarah Whitmore. Her mother had been a distant friend of Elelanina's when the Harrows first moved to the area. At the time of the events, Sarah was only 6 years old, but she remembered her mother talking about Elelanina in the years that followed. Her mother always spoke with a sad tone that young Sarah couldn't understand then, but now knows was guilt. Her mother thought she should have done more, like insisting on staying in touch even when Elelanina clearly wanted to be alone. Sarah told Elelanina a part of a conversation her mother had told her about, words Elelanina had said during one of their last meetings before she completely cut off all social contact. Elelanina had talked about how the quiet of the mountains was both a blessing and a curse. She said that when it was completely still, you could finally hear your own thoughts, but sometimes those thoughts were the last things you wanted to hear. Sarah now understood that there was recognition there. The isolation they wanted might not be a solution, but just a way to put off inevitable confrontations. Chen also found letters in the county archives that were sent between Stone and officials from other states during the first investigations. One of these letters, from a Kentucky sheriff, talked about a couple who fit the Harrows' description and who had been in his area for a short time in 1904. The sheriff in Kentucky said they were clearly troubled people who were always looking over their shoulders, as if they were expecting to be followed, and wouldn't say where they came from or where they were going. He had given them directions and let them go. Now, 4 years later, he was writing about it and wondering if he could have changed what happened next by being more forceful. Chen's research culminated in an academic thesis that analyzed both the specific case of the Harrows and the broader trend of families pursuing extreme isolation in the mountainous Appalachian region during the 19th and 20th centuries. He contended that these narratives exposed essential conflicts within the American experience, juxtaposing ideals of self-sufficient independence with the intrinsic human necessity for community and connection. In his story, the Harrows were an extreme example of this tension, taking the idea of isolation to its most extreme conclusions. Chen's thesis got some attention from academics, but it didn't have much of an effect outside of those circles. People still liked the more sensational versions of the story, which promised ghosts and curses instead of talking about how fragile the mind is and how being alone can affect you. The tourist trips went on, and each guide added their own details to the story, slowly turning it into something that was more like made-up fiction than real history. A forest fire swept through the mountains in 1985 during a very dry summer. It burned down a lot of trees, including the area where the Harrow property used to be. When the firefighters finally got the fire under control, all that was left were ashes and burned trees where thick plants used to grow. The fire had once again revealed the stone foundations of the old house. They were broken and moved by decades of roots and erosion, but they were still recognizable as human-made in the middle of all the natural destruction. State archaeologists took advantage of the chance to do an official excavation of the site. This was the first systematic investigation since Stone's original searches more than 70 years ago. They carefully went through the layers of soil and ash, making a list of every piece of broken pottery, rusted metal, and other debris they found. They didn't find any clear answers about what happened to Thomas and Elelanina in the end, but the excavation showed things about their lives that previous accounts hadn't mentioned. The artifacts told a story of a life that was getting more and more dangerous. Broken tools that were never fixed, household items that were constantly being patched up, and signs of a diet that was getting more and more limited in recent months. It was a picture of people who were not only mentally alone, but also having a hard time making ends meet and dealing with practical survival issues that probably made their mental problems worse. The archaeological report showed that the Harroves were real people who were stuck between their own and others' limitations, and were looking for answers to problems that might never have good ones. The excavation also found something that the first investigators didn't: the foundations of a smaller building near the main house, which could have been a barn or storage room. They found something that stood out among the rubble of this building: a small, fireproof metal box with more diary pages inside. These were written by Thomas in the last days of his life. The pages were damaged but still readable, and what they said was both eye-opening and very upsetting in its simplicity. Thomas wrote about the choice he and Alelanina made, which was a silent agreement made during long winter nights when everything became too much to handle. There weren't any clear details, just vague hints about the path they had taken and the peace they hoped to find beyond the world they had never been able to live in comfortably. These words came from someone who was completely worn out, not from one thing, but from decades of fighting against forces they never fully understood, but that had shaped every part of their life. The excavation results were added to old documents, making a story that seemed to have no clear end even more complicated. Archaeologists published their reports, and academics argued over what they meant. Gradually, professional interest faded again, leaving the Harrove story to return to the realm of local conversations and tourist trips that continued to draw curious visitors to that clearing in the mountains. As it always does, the forest eventually came back to life after the fire. New trees grew up around the stone foundations, their branches crossing over the spot where a house had been for years. Life went on in its usual way, unaffected by the short-lived dramas of humans that broke up its patterns. Birds made nests, deer grazed in the clearing, and the seasons changed in a way that was comforting and didn't make a difference between places that had seen tragedy and those that had only known peace. The area is now part of a protected forest reserve. There are well-kept trails that go near the site, and sometimes hikers find the moss-covered rocks without knowing where they came from. There are no signs or markers that tell you what happened there, and there is no official memorial for Thomas and Alelanina Harrove. For most people, it's just another pretty part of the Appalachian Mountains that looks like so many others. But for people who know the story, or a version of it, the place still has a special quality. There are no credible reports of supernatural events or ghostly sightings, so it's not haunting in the usual way. It's something more subtle. The idea that some places hold the weight of the events they see, that the stones and earth hold memories even when there are no living people left to tell the stories correctly. The Harrove story is now part of the culture of that part of the Appalachians. It is one of many stories that the mountains hold. For different people, it has different uses. For some, it's just a scary story to tell around the campfire. For others, it's a reminder of how weak people can be and how dangerous it can be to be alone. For the few who have actually read the original documents, it is a reminder that we often fail to help those who need it most. This is not because we don't care, but because people have internal struggles that are hard for others to see, let alone fix. The mountains are still quiet and old, not caring about the stories that happen in their shadows. They were there long before the first settlers came, and will still be there long after the last memories of the Harroves have faded away. It's comforting to think that our personal dramas, no matter how big they seem right now, are just small parts of the vastness of time and space. Maybe that's what Thomas and Alelanina were looking for in those mountains, a way to see things that makes them feel less heavy and makes problems that seem impossible to solve seem like small details in a much bigger picture. But the cruel irony is that being alone doesn't usually give you a new point of view. Instead, it tends to make things worse, turning worries into obsessions, fears into certainties, and quiet thoughts into screams that drown out any voice of reason that might still be there. We will never know for sure what happened on that last night of January 1908. The documents give us bits and pieces. The testimonies give us ideas, and our minds fill in the blanks with ideas that may or may not be true. Maybe this uncertainty is okay. Some stories don't have clear endings. Some mysteries stay mysteries because the people who lived them took the whole truth with them when they died. We can take these stories with us and let them teach us something about being human, about how important it is to stay connected even when the world seems hostile, and about knowing when we or someone we care about needs more help than we can give them alone. The Harrows chose to slowly cut ties with each other, leaving them with no ties to hold them to their shared reality. They made this choice many times over the years, and each time it seemed like the right thing to do. But in the end, they ended up in a place where they couldn't go back. The story stays in the mountains, where the wind whispers it through the pines and the shadows move across the clearing at dusk. It is not perfectly preserved in the memory of a place that has seen so much over the years. It is a story that is now as much a part of history as it is of imagination, living in a gray area between fact and legend, where the most powerful stories often live.